Welcome back, everyone. Doing a talk right after lunch has either the benefit of everyone being satisfied after their meal or the maybe negative of potentially, folks falling asleep because the meal was too good. So hopefully I'll be able to keep it interesting enough for everyone to stay awake for the next 30 minutes. So the title of the talk is Expanding Expanding Impact Metrics Context with Software Citation. I know that's a mouthful. This is an exploration of work that has been done by myself and my collaborator, Matt Mayernick. We're both in the NCAR library working on a number of institutional metrics and scholarly metrics activities for the organization writ large. So I'll begin with sort of contextualizing this entire space for everyone. Not everyone may know or understand what is going on in the scholarly metrics world and sort of how we got to the place that we are today. In particular, I talk about DOI, citable objects, and why these things are important. And then I'll move the conversation a little bit more towards things that probably everyone in this particular space and community is familiar with, but may not necessarily have a high degree of access to. So I'll talk about, in particular, data and software citation. The software citation piece is the focal point of this particular talk, and we will talk about how we decided to develop an organizational software citation strategy. And give a little bit of the reasons behind why we did that, and the motivators for moving in that direction. We'll talk about the work that we actually did and implemented last year, and then I'll wrap up with some conclusions on the work, some takeaways, and some next steps. All right. So let's talk a little bit about scholarly impact. Most everyone here is fully aware of the work in scholarly metrics. If you're not directly familiar with it, you are certainly familiar with it if you've written any papers. And those papers, you're probably constantly checking for new citations, figuring out where your work is being used and where your work is flowing. So publications in general have always been this kind of cornerstone of research and fundamental to, how we view and measure research impact. And of course, citation counts are a very important part of that. There's no denying that. We know that it is important to have our work cited, and more importantly, to know who is citing our work. And so that's, in many academic realms, that is really how we get the credit that we deserve, and actually in most of them as well, how we get evaluated. We also look at these metrics and scholarly metrics around how we are collaborating with others. So we look at co-authorship networks, we look at institutional collaborations, and these also count quite a bit towards how your reach is being measured. So are you collaborating with a lot of varied authors outside of your institution, or with specific institutions that might have particular strengths in a research area, et cetera. But I want to add, a very important aspect to this is that impact does not equal publication. So what we want to realize is that scholarly impact is multidimensional. Publications play an important role, but not the only role. And as we move through this talk, hopefully I'll convince you that that it is there are these other inputs to the research enterprise that we really do need to be paying attention to. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this citation problem. So, as I sort of laid the foundation in the previous slide, traditional metrics obviously rely on citation counts and those links. So we want to know how many times your work is cited, but also who is citing it, you know, what papers, what authors, what institutions, et cetera. And so as you might imagine, if you don't know much about the space, getting those citation counts requires a tremendous amount of really good metadata, right? So, you know, you might imagine that if you were going to try, if we didn't have DOIs, which I'll talk about in just a second, if we didn't have DOIs, you know, you'd imagine some kind of way to track your work, and in some way you'd need some unique identifier that would allow you to pass that unique identifier along while other people are citing your work nearly everywhere. So this is a common problem, and you know, understanding how to build those links and understanding how to develop a strategy for persistent identifiers has been the conversation of a lot of the bibliometric work for a long time, you know, for many decades actually. So for those of you who don't know and are familiar with DOIs, you know, the digital object identifier system is rather young. If we take a look at it in the perspective of it's kind of the age of the web as we know it, or the age of the public internet. So in 1996, there were proposals floating around about how to improve the structural integrity, if you will, of the way in which works are cited and referenced. And so in 1998, the International DOI Foundation was launched to try to address this problem. At the core of this problem is link rot. You know, I mean, everyone, you know, despises going to a website that returns a 404, but this is actually even more despicable when we're talking about a paper that was published in a journal that you would expect to exist somewhere, and just a simple URL. As we know, the web shifts quite a bit, and websites go down, links change. Folks who make those changes don't necessarily provide relinking of any of that material, and so links break. In 2000, the first DOI resolution application went online. And from that point, you know, we're looking at now almost 21 years. The DOI system has been in place. And as most of you know, when you publish a paper somewhere, you will get a DOI for it. And the DOI is intended to be actionable, interoperable, persistent. And the persistent part is the most important piece in many ways, because when that DOI resolves, it should resolve permanently in perpetuity. There should be a resolution at all times to any DOI that is actually registered. And I want to add to this that there is no requirement that a DOI points to a paper. In fact, there's no requirement that it points to a publication of any kind. It can be any object, any entity, physical, digital, or abstract. And I think most people don't necessarily realize that, because they see that that DOIs are meant to mostly for papers. Now, non-publications, you know, moving into this conversation about persistent links to any entity, physical, digital, or abstract. In the earlier days of DOIs, you know, people were minting DOIs for things that were not papers, but it was not necessarily a popular activity. And for the most part, the initial drivers were for things regarding publication. Non-publication came on and came to the attention of many people, you know, towards the mid 2005, 6, 7 range. And in 2009, an organization called Datasite was founded with 7 founding members. Datasite was really designed to address the problem of how do we develop a strategy for making data as persistent as what was occurring with publications. And so when I cite something, and this really comes out of a lot of the work that was being done at that point in time in the realm of you know, linked objects, linked data objects. So when I have a paper, it is related to other things like the research inputs, the data, the software, the code, the people, et cetera, the institutions, et cetera. And so This is something that, as we can see, Datasite has grown rather tremendously over the last 12 years. And, it started with a small 7 founding members, and now there are over 700 members with nearly 31 million DOIs minted to date. And the idea behind Dataset, made a lot of sense at the time, even though the uptake of what Datasite's platform was trying to accomplish really didn't take off until about 2015 or so, when you might have seen journals were starting to publish dataset citation recommendations. So let's talk a little bit about software metrics. So why are we interested in software? Well, there are some pretty obvious answers to that. One is that a large proportion of work that's being done today is actually software. So there are groups that spend their time exclusively writing software and do not spend much time writing papers. So on the one hand, the credit that they get is received from the community that they are producing that software for. And if the community is unaware of how that software needs to be measured and its use needs to be followed, then oftentimes these projects end up falling a bit flat because they can't point to anything tangible with respect to how they are impacting the community that the software is being developed for. So, if you want to track your software, right, you could look at download metrics, but of course, download metrics don't tell you a lot. There are, if you get the wrong 8-year-old, clicking the same link over and over and refreshing, well, you might end up with 100 downloads, and that gives you a skewed view of reality in many ways. There are usage metrics, and some software does embed the phone home code, if you will. With respect to open source software, this is often looked down on. It's an unfavorable practice in many ways because folks don't necessarily want to, there's a fine line with respect to how far that goes, and implementing more and more usage metrics can get a little tricky. And then, of course, there are citation metrics, right? So if I had a persistent identifier for my work, it would be rather easy for me to track it, as long as the people who are using my software and or writing papers that use my software are aware of how to cite it. All right, so let's talk about what happened last year in the first quarter of 2020 and what we were trying to accomplish with software metrics at NCAR. So NCAR at the current state has nearly over 600 open source GitHub repos that are freely and open and available. Now, as many of you know, these repositories aren't all research software. The majority of these are maybe smaller repositories that people may have set up for personal projects that are related to some research, or in many ways, some of the projects are just empty projects. There are quite a few of those actually. But the idea that we were trying to understand is, why or how can we understand the broader software citation landscape within NCAR, and also look at some of the best practices that are out there and understand, are people using DOIs? If they aren't, why are they, broadly utilizing the best practices in terms of allowing their community access to the citation, recommendations that they would like. So in late 2019, we had pretty much looked at GitHub, the open repos, and under the NCAR organization. At that time, we had 428 repositories with only 14 of those, which is a meager number of repositories with a DOI or a mention of a DOI. And I say a mention of a DOI because there were some repositories that actually mentioned DOIs that were not related to the software that was part of that repository for one reason or another. We did that by analyzing the README files. We just went through and started to parse those files and look for indications of DOI references. Of those 14, only 5 of those repositories actually had clear attribution information. That is to say that they let the community know how they wanted their software, cited. And then the other trickier bit of our original evaluation was understanding the licensing, right? So when you write software, it's probably a pretty important best practice, of course, to put a license on it. And we found that nearly half of the repositories did not have a license at all. Now, this is one of those things where when you build a repository, when you initialize it, depending on where you initialize it, how you initialize it, there are prompts through the initialization phase where GitHub does ask you, would you like to apply a license? A lot of people just ignore that. So, we began with these questions. Why are there so many inconsistencies? Why, is this an issue of the community does not understand DOIs for software? Is it an issue of they don't understand how to mint a DOI, or what we really wanted to discover what were the barriers for this scenario that we were seeing, because clearly some of the repositories we felt most certainly reached the bar of having a DOI and doing a little bit better of a job making sure that the end users understood what it was that they were supposed to be doing. So we came up with a strategy beginning with sort of an initial analysis of the existing landscape. We decided that we were going to go query the community, administer a survey, and take a look at what was going to come out of that survey. We used that survey to guide our recommendation, which I'll begin in the next couple of slides. And we developed a draft recommendation, presented that draft to the folks that we administered the survey to, and then revised that based on feedback that we got. And then we pushed that publicly, made a public announcement across the organization that we were promoting a citation recommendation. So that was sort of the basic strategy that we took. In terms of the survey, what we did was we mined the top 10% of the repos in the GitHub organization. That actually yielded maybe one of the best strategies we've seen so far. We had a nearly 40% response rate. In fact, I think it was slightly higher than that, but that blew our mind that we were able to get that many people to respond. So it actually gave us some hope that we had struck a chord somewhere in terms of the need for some guidance in this area. So we looked at policies, tools, licenses, and community behaviors in the survey. It was a shortish survey, but it hit. There were at least 2 questions in each one of these areas, and we were able to really drill down into some very useful questions. The highlights of this: 4 and 5 respondents said that they thought having a DOI was, or other persistent identifier for their software, was important. So, that's good news. And more than 90% agreed that having some sort of acknowledgement information about how they would like their software to be acknowledged was also important. Interestingly, though, only 1 in 4 say they had a published citation policy or acknowledgement policy. And then, only half of those with those policies said that they had a formal citation. So even though folks thought having a published acknowledgement policy was important, they actually weren't making it formal. They weren't putting it out and up front in front of the users to let them know. All right, so after we processed the survey, we developed a recommendation. In that recommendation, we did some iterative refinement, as I mentioned before. And what we really found was that, and much of what we found, most illustrative in terms of how we were going to guide the the framing of our recommendation was in the additional comments that people made, which we were also shocked at how many, how much interest there was in saying more about this topic when we administered the survey. But anyway, what we really wanted to do was provide some examples, but make things very simple, make the recommendation accessible and actionable, because we know, if it was a 30-page recommendation, no one would read it, and it'd probably be so confusing after the second page that no one would use it. So we wanted to touch in on how to mint a DOI, touch in on how to give some guidance on clear instructions on how you want your software cited, and then how to select an appropriate license. And I will say in the next slide that NCAR does not have a standard license, software license policy, though we do have some licenses that, tend to strike the balance between what, as an institution, how we value the software and how we want our community to use it. So minting DOIs is a very straightforward thing. Most people didn't know who to talk to about minting a DOI, and that, is really just an issue around promotion, just letting people know, here's where you go if you want a DOI for your software. We did ask questions about Zenodo. For those of you, in the session right now, you may know about the Zenodo. If you don't, you probably should. We asked questions about what Zenodo meant to the community that we surveyed. A lot of folks did not know anything about Zenodo, and then some folks were actually using it. So part of our recommendation on minting a DOI was that, if you don't want to mint a DOI directly through the NCAR library, which we can set you up with directly, you could mint a DOI through Zenodo, which is more of an automated process. We also let folks know what they needed in terms of minimum metadata. We didn't have a high bar for metadata at all, but a bar nonetheless. I mean, I say it wasn't high, not to say that it was trivial, but there is minimum metadata that is required. Then we decided that we wanted to let the recommendation give guidance on how to publish your attribution on your GitHub page, what kind of language you might want to use, and even embedding the DOI badges, the attribution badge, on the README page. So there are badges you can add that allow a very quick visual on a DOI having been minted for this particular repository. So those in-user citation instructions were important. And then selecting a license. Licensing, what we found from the survey was a lot of people understood the value of licenses, even though they were confused by what license to choose. So what we decided to do was narrow the focus and encourage Apache BSD or MIT licenses, and then point the users to other places they might learn about licenses in the event that they felt like those licenses or did not understand those licenses. They could learn a little bit more to make a more intelligent, informed decision about what license. But that is, very important, because we do want to make sure that there is a license for the important software that we produce. Okay, so our recommendation is actually at the link below, ncar.github.io/software-citation. And that is open and free for anyone to take a look at. And we'd actually welcome any feedback from anyone on the call as well. So let's talk about takeaways, and it looks like I've got maybe 4.5 minutes to take questions if I get past these slides quickly. Big takeaway was it's really important to query the community and to just have a good understanding about where things are. How do people access the information that you're asking them? Do they even know who's responsible within the organization for it? Those types of things you might take for granted as public and open and common knowledge, but we found that was not the case. The other big takeaway, I think, was that there were quite a few respondents who did not quite understand why software citation was even important. This was a little bit of a surprise, even though after looking at some of the comments further, it became a little clearer, where the misunderstanding was in terms of the importance. And then, of course, mining GitHub is pretty effective. I mean, I think there were a lot of things we learned about what is actually going on in those repositories as well. What's next? We're nearing the 12-month mark, so we're going to review the current recommendation, take a look at what has happened, how many DOIs have we minted, perhaps as a result of this, or maybe query the community a little further and find out if there are still gaps in understanding and knowledge about where to go. We'll probably do a little bit more in terms of our best practices need to be updated. We're working on formalizing the workflow that we produce for the software citation tracking so that we can actually just keep track of these citation counts for people. At some point, we do want to provide that as a service to the community so they can actually see what their citation counts are, just like they can see their citation counts on the publications. And then finally, we are working to integrate this into the OpenSky institutional repository, where if a paper references some software, we will also have the linkages in the institutional repository display for that paper. So that will be hopefully another trigger for many people to realize that the citation is important. Okay, thank you for your time. And I've got 3 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions. You can connect with me or Matt with our emails below, and you can also take a look at our recommendation. We'd be happy to answer those questions.